So my talk is about the tailor, which is actually, which Stefan didn't mention, is not my story, it's actually from Bertolt Brecht, which I kind of took from him, one of the Tailor of Ulm, which I think is one of the most fantastic poems from Bertolt Brecht on that matter. So I talk today a bit about my research in the area of environmental policy and Earth system governance and my take on all these issues. And to start with, is the mess, in a way, in which we are. And this is the mess which is quite often subscribed by the shorthand of the Anthropocene. The situation in our planet where we are recognizing our planetary system as an integrated, interdependent systems of people and non-human agents. But at the same time, we also recognize, as you can see here in the Amsterdam Declaration of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program from 2001, already 20 years old, the statement that humans are now in a position to move the Earth system into new states of operation, two modes of operation, and that those modes of operation may prove irreversible, less hostile to humans. And that means that this can mean a fundamental crisis to people on Earth, and that this is, I believe, the biggest challenge for our generation in the 21st century to address these issues. The shorthand for the situation of Earth system transformation is quite often the Anthropocene. A term widely used describes the situation in which people are now so dominant on the planetary scale that they are driving the Earth system potentially to new modes of operation. And I believe that the emergence of this epoch of the Anthropocene fundamentally changes the way how social science should be organized as a research program. And I mention this because I understand that most people in the audience are from the social science communities in Hamburg and beyond. I believe that here in the 21st century, we need fundamentally new types of governance. We need to have a new type of planetary understanding for cooperation among people and societies, new ways of developing governance models for deep time, for periods of time that are beyond generations. And because of all of this, I also believe that we as social sciences have to develop new types of political critique. And these are fundamental challenges for political science. And I think also one of the fundamental challenges probably for colleagues at the center in Hamburg that you are representing. The Anthropocene has been criticized. And I also believe that some scholars from University of Hamburg belong to those who are also critical of the concept. The main criticism, and this I very much share, is that the idea of the Anthropocene tends to make all humans equal. It tends to hide away situations of oppression, situations of hundreds of years of colonialism, and just the plain fact that people are not different. It hides the fact that there are only 10, 20% of human population that have an impact on our planet that is much, much larger than the rest. And this is sometimes hidden away by this idea about one humankind. And this is a critique, and then we have to address it. And I think that's very important to deconstruct these Anthropocene discourses that are not really taking this critique into account. Some people also argue that the Anthropocene leads to a techno-managerialism. That's also one critique. I do not share it. I think the dangers are there, especially when we talk about solar geoengineering, which I think is a great danger and a big mistake to go into this direction. Come back to that. But this is not necessarily given. I think just understanding or thinking Anthropocene terms does not mean necessarily that we have to engage in geoengineering. I think there's a separation, and we'll talk about this later. There have been many people who suggested other terms instead of Anthropocene that are related to capitalism, that are related to gender, that are related to colonialism and other terms. And I think they all have a point, and they're all fantastic communities who try to come up with new concepts. Unfortunately, I must say, I did not find any concept really better grabbing the current situation, because everything is kind of focusing on one particular aspect, but not all the others. So therefore, for lack of alternatives, I still use the word Anthropocene, because so far I could not come up with a better term. None of the other terms that you find on Twitter and in the literature are any more convincing to me because they are too narrow and too much focus on one term. But, and I think this is very important, especially for the social sciences have been the pioneers of the critique of the Anthropocene term and worked towards a much more nuanced understanding of what this term means. But the sum is that we have to move away from traditional concepts of environmental policy towards a more planetary understanding of the position of people on the planet, which is different from what has been the situation in the last century. And this has led me many years actually ago to argue already that the concept of environmental policy is fundamentally outdated. I've talked about this 20 years ago. I have now published a new paper that is bringing this all a bit together. And Stefan has used this also in the webinar series. I was never really a fan of the concept of Umweltpolitik in German. I was never attracted to this term because I always felt that the idea of Umwelt, of environment, is emphasizing, this is point number one, a dichotomy of humans and nature that doesn't work anymore. The idea that there are people and there is an Umwelt, an environment around people is just 19th century. I think this is not the description of our situation anymore. Maybe it has never been. And also the idea of environment, environmental policy, environmental protection doesn't really relate to these new ideas of a system approach, socio-ecological systems at local scale, but also planetary scale. So therefore, I think also here environmental policy doesn't really help. Importantly, I also believe that environmental policy in the mainstream interpretation, how it has been conducted at universities, but also in ministries and agencies and other bodies, has always de-emphasized important questions of justice and democracy. Of course, there has been for the last 20 or 30 years a debate on environmental justice, and these are very important colleagues and they're very important publications have been written on it. But I would believe they have been marginalized in the mainstream discourse for long. And I also believe that, that it has to be much more front and center, the debate on justice and debate on democracy. And this has been neglected by the mainstream environmental discourse, and therefore we need other paradigms. Fundamentally, I also believe that the environmental policy debate and the paradigm does not help us to deal with the very novel normative challenges of the Anthropocene. And I think this is one of the most important consequences of Anthropocene thinking, which is assuming that we as people in all our conflicts and inequalities, that we as people are shaping the planet. And this is what we are actually doing. We are shaping climate, biodiversity, and all these other Earth systems. That means also we have to engage in debates of how we want to have it actually. And that is, for example, the core idea about the planetary boundaries as a core idea of the 1.5 or 2 degree target in the climate convention, that governments in particular are getting together and are agreeing on normative targets for Earth system transformation, for the normative corridors on our planet. And this is not new, this we have never done before. And I think our institutions are absolutely not in a position to deal with these kind of challenges. I mean, how can we really decide on how we want to have the planet in 2050 or 2100? And finally, I believe that the environmental policy paradigm has led in the past also to a marginalization of very, very important issues such as climate, for example. I believe the tradition of putting climate, for example, or biodiversity, many of these other challenges into environmental policy has essentially led to their marginalization because environmental policy has been marginalized in decision-making and public discourses for long. And this, I think, is one of the reasons also, not one of the many, many reasons for the predicament in which we are finding ourselves. So therefore, I believe we have to move away from the environmental policy paradigm and explore new ideas and new concepts and really revisit all our institutions, all our paradigms to think through the challenges of politics, of governance in the Anthropocene. And this has led me, and together also with many colleagues since then, to the development of an idea of Earth system governance. And Earth system governance we define as, on the one hand, as Stefan has pointed out, now also emerged into a global research community of hundreds of people working together. It's essentially a paradigm that tries to, a broad paradigm that tries to understand politics in different terms and times of socio-ecological system changes beyond the environment at planetary scale. So it breaks with the human nature and human environment dichotomies of the past. It adopts a system perspective of socio-ecological systems that are integrated. And I would argue it brings in an explicit focus on justice, also on democracy and planetary interdependence. So it's an experiment. It's an experiment of bringing together people, of thinking about these issues and what it actually means to go beyond the environmental policy paradigm and think about what Earth system governance could actually mean. Importantly, and this is a very frequent misunderstanding, Earth system governance is not necessarily only about global institutions. It's not about United Nations and reforming the United Nations. It is a process that is also very much important at the local level in daily struggles in cities, villages, wherever it is. So it's not only a study, a research program, an activity at the global level, but all the local analysis and also the local struggles will be in a planetary perspective. So it's always thinking from the planetary perspective, but also at the local level. So it's not only a global issue. And that leads me to a couple of consequences, and I can just briefly run through them in this talk, but there are publications and websites that are going into much more detail on all of them. Number one is, and this has been part of my research agenda for the last 25 years, we have to revisit the system, how international relations are being organized. I mean, essentially, if you compare these two photos here, on the right side, you see how the planet functions in a way, and on the left side, you see how people have organized societies in 190 countries with independent governments, all kind of differences, and that are working essentially against cooperation, against working together to deal with these planetary challenges. And we need to have ways of working together and also advancing, I come back to this later, advancing not only global collaboration, but also global justice. And this means that we have to find ways of breaking up the existing institutions and trying to develop new institutions. And this is a huge challenge for the social sciences. I would believe also that it's especially a challenge, of course, for international relations, where I think that much more transformative thinking is also needed. I think the academic community is quite often very empirically analytical oriented, and I think we need bold ideas about how we can really reorganize governance at the planetary scale to cope with the challenges of climate change, biodiversity, food, water, all these other crises. And I think this is one key element of research. And it's not new. I mean, many people have proposed these ideas. I mean, there was a Nobel laureate symposium in 2011 already, where they talked about that we need strengthening Earth system governance. And the State of the Planet Declaration in 2012 argued also that we have fundamentally to reorient and restructure institutions for effective Earth system governance. The International Council for Science wanted even to overhaul the entire UN system. So it's not a unique opinion, but it's still a huge research agenda. And I also don't have clear answers to all of these issues. So I'm still studying this and still trying to explore with many others, especially in the Earth System Governance Research Network, how we can criticize existing institutions, develop new institutions that are better able and more equitably able to deal with these challenges. The book that Stefan mentioned, it's one of my favorite books, not only because every chapter starts with a poem of a German poet, as one of my literary idiosyncrasies, but also because my daughter is actually on the front cover. That's what Stefan didn't mention. I mean, she was very proud. No, we wanted to have, MIT Press wanted to have the future generations, and then I had one little one, the tree hugger, and she was at that time extremely proud to be on the book cover. But this is a book in which I experimented with a number of ideas of how global governance could be organized differently in small chapters. So it's about the Council for Sustainable Development in the UN replacing the ECOSOC, new trusteeship councils, new modes of voting representation. I worked on climate migration, climate refugee organizations. I had a long-standing interest in upgrading the United Nations Environment Program to an international organization of some standing. So, and in this book, I experimented with lots of these ideas and tried to elaborate them further. And I'm still continuing also this work together with many others in trying to reimagining the United Nations and international governance system. I mean, one proposal that I find most puzzling still is the need to develop new ways of decision-making at the global level. Because the current UN is essentially functioning on 19th, 20th century ideas about one country, one vote, largely based on consensus. So over 70% of environmental treaties are based on consensus. That means that always the least interested country is determining the course of affairs. And this is not really working for really fundamental decisions. So we need to engage in some type of majority decision-making. But the question is how to organize this. And there's very, very little research is being done on these issues. I mean, like if you go for one country, one vote, that means that you have immediately a majority of only 5% of human population are the majority because they're organized in tiny countries, Andorra and Monaco and Liechtenstein and Luxembourg and all these places. If you say one person, one vote, then it's only 7 countries that are immediately the majority. So it's all very difficult to see, but we have to find new ways of decision making. And this is important because more and more areas of our affairs, if you talk about constraints of economic affairs, constraints of so many other issues, require decision making at global scale. And our institutions are not really ready to take these decisions. I mean, they're too outdated, they're too old-fashioned. We need new ideas about how we can really take decisions at the global level. And I give a couple of examples later in my talk. Then number 4, this is an issue that it's very dear to my heart, is that the current discourse is quite often not sufficiently engaged in questions of justice. And I think the justice question is one of the key questions when it comes to Earth system governance. And it requires more action, certainly, but from the academic perspective, also much more research. I mean, one slide out of many that could be possible. If one just looks at the private consumption at planetary scale, it's 20% of the people that are using up 80% of the resources of the planet. And 20% of the poorest people of the planet, they have only 1.5% of the private consumption of the planet. So it's really a situation of the most imaginable inequality. And this is the way how the planet, I mean, how humankind in a way is organized on this planet. No country is organized like that. And historically, it has never been that unequal. And it comes even, this is also widely tweeted around in the literature and known in the sense, it gets even worse, that the wealth is concentrating with the richest people, that the billionaires of the world have more than the poorest people on the planet, which are sometimes called the group of 8, that are private citizens. Legally, they have only one vote, but they have so huge financial resources and wealth that is just has a huge impact also on the way how governance is being conducted. This is sometimes also not sufficiently taken into account by some of the institutional discussions that we are having. So I believe that for Earth system governance, I published an article on this with a few colleagues. Prakash Kashwan was the lead author just last year, where we argued that the key for any discourse and for any debate on institutions planetary scale, but technically also local scale, should look and take this, what is known as Gandhi's talisman, that you see here in an original print as the basis. And Gandhi has said in the very briefly, shortly before he was killed, he said, recall whatever you're doing, recall the face of the poorest and the weakest person whom you have seen, and ask yourself, is the state, this what you are contemplating, the proposal, the institution, the governance mechanism, is this helping the poorest person? And this is kind of Gandhi's talisman. I think it's really very important for all our activities that we think them through from the perspective of global inequality and the situation of the poor. And I think that's a key challenge also for the Earth system governance. What we have done is we have set up a task force on planetary justice where people are getting together and trying to understand these issues more clearly. And justice questions are also very, very prioritized in the science and implementation plan of the Earth system governance project. So substantial resources are being invested in research on these issues. Another question which is related to that, and this I mentioned already on my second slide or my third slide, is the question about the future of our planet. And that means that if you take this Anthropocene idea seriously, that people in all their inequalities have the potential or do already change the entire planet, then the question is, what is the direction we want to take our planet? So what is the normative future in which we want to drive our planet? And an example that is widely known, of course, is the 2 degree or 1.5 degree from the Climate Convention, the target, which is a normative target for the planetary system. Here, governments, diplomats came together and agreed on a temperature target for the entire planet that is essentially meant to be forever. And this is one example. And I believe we have many, many more of these kind of discussions about what is the future of our planet and what are the normative values that we want to have. And this has been always described as sustainability, but we have now to engage in a process that is much more detailed. And here, if you look at one example, the planetary boundaries is one example of these debates, where scientists got together and defined 9 planetary boundaries, which are, in theory, a quantitative value of the Earth system. And the idea is that governments and actors and societies should not transgress these boundaries. So this is an operating space. It's the title of the article on planetary boundaries, the operating space for the planet and also for our society. These are normative values for the Anthropocene. And on the one hand, I like this. I mean, I have been involved in working with planetary boundaries for quite some time. On the other hand, I'm also very critical. And the critique here is largely about the origin of the idea of planetary boundaries, the way of how they are being constructed and who is organizing the processes. The criticism is here that it's essentially a science-driven process where it should be a society-driven process. Some of these boundaries have extremely high levels of contestation. For example, the boundary on freshwater use, the boundary on land use. They are not natural science-given boundaries. These are boundaries that are deciding of who is getting food. They're boundaries of how land is being used. They are boundaries about where land is being used, for what purposes. So these are boundaries that are so important that they should not be left to natural scientists. These are boundaries that need to be defined by societal processes. This is my main critique, and I published an article with my colleague Rakim about this, and we argued about the boundaries of the planetary boundaries, where we try to criticize the approach, mainly about the main point is that this is nothing to be left to natural science, but is rather a process for a societal, it's a case for a societal process to think this through. I gave already this example. The alternative that the United Nations have come up with are the SDGs and Sustainable Development Goals. And there are, they have the same idea that societies are getting this number of normative values, goals here, the global goals, Sustainable Development Goals, and societies and governments should work towards achieving these goals. In this case, they are not informed necessarily by natural science, but they're the outcome of a political process, driven by governments, but also involving lots of stakeholders. And this is an alternative. The problem is here that these goals are sometimes extremely ad hoc. They're quite often conflicting. They're lacking, to some extent, scientific evidence. That's why many scientists also saying now we have to replace the SDGs with science-based targets. So it's kind of a tension between the scientific perspective and societal process in which norms and values are being defined at planetary scale. Both are very important, but we have to study these processes, I believe, in much more detail. And I'm very curious, especially on these decision processes at planetary scale. So in a way, you could say that there are 3 kind of ideal types. There are goals that could be set by intergovernmental decision-making, which is kind of what the United Nations would do in treaties. I mean, the climate goal from the Climate Convention, the 2-degree target, is a target that has been agreed by governments in an UN negotiation process. And you could argue that this is following, to some extent, the model of representation, that citizens are involved in electing their governments, and then governments negotiate these targets at planetary scale. That's one approach. The other approach is the more pluralistic approach, which you could see as the SDGs, where you have different civil society groups, maybe even business, also scientists, also governments, different stakeholders coming together and jointly discussing this. So in a sense, everybody's at the table. The legitimacy here would be through participation. It's another approach is possible, which you find especially in the SDG, but also in many private governance mechanisms. And the third one would be what is essentially behind the planetary boundaries idea, that scientists are discovering the truth. There's a truth out there. Scientists, mainly natural scientists, regardless of where they're coming from. That's also a point because, I mean, 90% of the scientists are from the OECD countries, but in the science, it's not really a topic for debate that much. So here you would argue scientific autonomy is the mechanism to define targets, normative values at planetary scale for the future. So these are different options. And I think they have all kind of benefits, but also dangers. So I'm very much interested in spending more time on that. We do this research in Utrecht. This is part of my Global Goals project that Stefan has mentioned. The Global Goals project is originally funded to work only on the SDGs. It was the original research idea that we sold to the ERC, but it has expanded to also look now at other issues and other ways of how global goals are being defined. One thing that we are also doing is assessing the impacts of such goal-setting processes. So we have now led an international network of scientists to study the steering effect of sustainable development goals so far. So they have been agreed in 2015. So how can we really judge the effectiveness of these goals now in 2021 after 6 years of operation? So there's also a research program on studying the effects of goal setting at planetary scale. So this is some parts of our work, and if you're interested, we have a website and a Twitter handle, and more is to come. I want to rush a little bit. I think time is running. What's very important also, a part of the Anthropocene debate is the risk part. So we are facing potentially a transformative risk for the planet. I mean, if something goes wrong, if we are not, for example, making the climate targets, then we are entering a planet as we have never seen it before. I mean, as humans have never seen it before. Fundamentally different world. We don't know exactly how it would look like, but the impacts can be fundamental. I think that's also a huge responsibility. I mean, that's kind of one has also to see it. And this is what I'd sometimes like to tell my students. Actually, I mean, to the extent that students are listening, there's the most important field of study actually at the entire university, because the threats of these transformations are so fundamental for humans and non-human species. This is really one of the most important areas of academic inquiry at our time. For example, I mean, where I'm based in Netherlands, there's on the left side, you see a nice sketch in a sense, which one of my colleagues from the geoscience faculty has made in a late night activity where he sketched how the Netherlands might look like in 200 years. Which means essentially that Utrecht is gone and Amsterdam is gone, and we have somehow retreated to the eastern part, which is almost Germany in that case. No? It's kind of all ideas and scenarios and possibilities, but these are the risks that we have. And I think it's also a challenge for social science, not only to prevent them, but also to think about what could happen if we are not making these values. So as Bob Watson has said in 2009, when I heard this the first time, that was in Guardian, I still remember when I read it, I was quite shocked. I mean, he said, I mean, we have to prepare actually to adapt to 4 degrees. We should politically always go for 2, but we have to prepare for 4 degrees. And this is what many people said, especially at that time. I was focused in my own research on climate migration. So I was very concerned and academically interested in developing governance systems that can protect people that have to leave their places because of climate impacts. So I worked on a governance system to protect climate refugees, or climate migrants, as they're quite often called now, and also some other types of global adaptation research, because I think that's also very much an understudied research area. I know that in North Germany, there are quite a few programs on these issues. I think it's very important to invest time here. There's another alternative that is being proposed these days, and here I also, it's kind of one of my current research areas, is what I call the false answer of ecomodernism, which is solar geoengineering. And that is proposed by a range of actors these days as a potential solution. Not solution is the wrong word. I mean, so a potential additional element in a climate policy mix, let's put it this way, that if politicians are not able to really, and societies, whatever, if you're not making the 2 degrees and we're overshooting and going to 3 degrees and 4 degrees, so the idea is that by artificial injections of stratospheric sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere, we can block parts of the sunlight and cool the planet. And there are lots of these different ideas out there, but this is right now probably the most prominent one. And it is increasingly being normalized. So the National Academy of Science in the United States has said we should invest more research on these issues. And Nature, the journal Nature, has also supported this and said that we need more research on planetary solar geoengineering to look at these issues. And I believe this is a fundamental mistake because I believe that it will lead to a distraction from current decarbonization policies. That's number one, that the oil industry and fossil fuel countries, etc., they will kind of jump at this and will delay decarbonization because there's always a second option of geoengineering. And secondly, also because I believe you can't govern it. I think under assumptions of justice and democracy, you can't govern it. You can govern it if you have a colonial vision of the future. I mean, if you say imperialism is not a problem, then you probably can govern it under imperialistic modes of operation. I think not under a just way. And we have worked on this quite a bit. One important part of the current debate on geoengineering is the disbalance of those who talk about it. I wrote one paper with my colleague Ina Möller in which we looked at the speakers at international conferences on geoengineering. And they were essentially from 3 countries only. They were from the United States, United Kingdom, and from Germany. And the Germans are also rather critical on these matters. It was a DFG project at the time. But essentially, there's nobody from a developing country really engaged in these debates. Many of them are not really informed. Countries, governments are not really informed. So here I have now last week, actually, taken the stance with colleagues. We brought together a team of 17 scholars, directors essentially from leading research institutions. So the director of SCI, the director of IDS, and a number of other organizations from Germany. It was supported by Dirk Messner, the president of the German Environmental Agency. So we said it should be stopped. So we just simply said that we need to have a global moratorium, a ban in a sense, on research on the certain and development. The development of technologies for solar geoengineering is not necessarily all research, and essentially to work against the normalization of these technologies. And we're turning this into a campaign. So we start after the summer, we will really get together and everybody is invited to join us. So we will have a website and we have more activities on these levels. And I'm really very committed to stop the normalization of planetary solar geoengineering as a normal, let's say, a normal research topic or as a normal part of climate policy. So if you're interested, I mean, very importantly, our group, I try to keep it very focused on this one issue. So we are not taking any position on carbon dioxide removal. That's another idea that maybe some people in Hamburg are also looking at, which is the artificial sucking out carbon dioxide of the atmosphere, and other things. So it's kind of, if you're interested, I'm happy to work with more people on these issues. And now coming quickly, I think that's the last block in a way to science. Now that's very important also, that we probably have to address different, we have to organize science differently. I'm not the first to say this. For the last 10, 20 years, people are talking about sustainability science, for example, the argument that we are out of the old way of working alone, but we have to work in large collaborative contexts. Also as social scientists, natural science are doing this since the 1950s, but also social science should work in these ways. From national research communities into an invisible global college, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work, and also maybe focus also on resolving issues. I mean, I'm very careful with the word useful because it depends also who is used and useful for whom. It's a very difficult term, but I believe we have to get out of the ivory tower, to put it this way. That doesn't mean that we have to necessarily work for industry. The critical research is also very important, which is also useful. So it should be getting out of the ivory towers to work in a global context. And my concern, and this has been in a critical perspective, for the last 20 years already, the scientific structure. So on the one hand, I believe we need global science collaboration and science networks. On the other hand, it's clear that they are absolutely dominated by the OECD countries. So it's a huge imbalance in who's speaking and who's doing research on matters of sustainability and beyond, of course. So I'm very interested in working on research and developing research program on decolonizing sustainability science and civil society and global governance. So I'm working on a book project here with my colleague Carol Ansenit. That's probably out next year. And just to give you examples of how we are doing our work, so we don't want to be too theoretical, it's just data-driven. So I believe here very much on data-driven, so we are just counting. We are counting speakers, we are counting editorial boards, we are counting all kind of participations, and also look at procedures. I mean, for example, we did a study which is just now forthcoming with a journal on civil society representation in the UN, where, for example, if you look at civil society speakers, in the open working group that organized the SDGs, 73% of civil society speakers were based in the global north, and 1/3 was American citizens. I mean, just as an example. And we have lots of these kind of data. And we're collecting more. So we have set up a group at Utrecht. We try to get more of this data together. It's not just passively data. We also look at the structures. I mean, how opinions are being formed, the procedures of how science is being shaped, how civil society is being shaped, also governance is being shaped. So this is one of my most recent activities to set up at Utrecht the Decolonizing Sustainability Group, and also turn this into a global effort. So I very also would like to learn from others, maybe also involve others. We started small here before the summer, but we also would like to involve many more people on working together on these issues. If you're interested, Decolonize us as our Twitter handle. We have not been very active yet, but after the summer, and we're all very relaxed, we will push this up and make it into a major activities, I hope. And then the last slide is an invitation. I mean, for those who are interested, is mainly, I mean, Stefan has already been at the ESG conference in Utrecht. So many of these issues, essentially all of these issues, are being discussed in the Earth System Governance Project. And there's a global network of scientists, largely social scientists, working together on these kind of issues since 2006 or 2009. We have conferences every year. We have a global network of research centers, book series, 3 different book series with publishing houses. We have an open journal, open access journal. And we are open for anybody. So everybody can come and join us as a research fellow or senior research fellow and be active. We're working through task forces. So the most recent has been just launched this week, actually, is the task force on climate governance. For those who are interested, we have in the community 190 people who are interested in climate issues, and we want to bring this together also now in this task force on climate governance and develop a research program on governance and climate issues, also with a very policy-oriented perspective. So on this, I'm closing. So I think this is a slide from 2015, a quote from 2015, but it hasn't changed much. That I think the challenges are tremendous. That with the SDGs and all these other ideas, I mean, there is the possibility for our generation to end poverty, to stop climate change. I think it's definitely possible. That's one of the reasons why I'm against solar geoengineering, because I think we have alternatives. It's possible. We can stop climate change without engaging in geoengineering. I'm very optimistic and very convinced that this is possible. But it's also a huge challenge, and this is the challenge of our generation. And that, I mean, everybody has to do their part, and that means for scientists and researchers and universities, it's a big challenge to get together and to find solutions, to critique the current institutions that do not work, to voice the criticism, develop the criticism, but also I think that's very important. Looking at my social science colleagues, sometimes it's not only enough to just sit in the chair and criticize. We also have to work together and try to find better solutions and be agents of change ourselves. Thank you so much.